Good morning. This is Rebecca Smith Aldridge, and you're here for the State Aid for Public Library Construction Grant Introductory webinar. This is our chance to help orient you to the state aid program for your construction grants that you might be applying for in the coming year, to help you understand what's an eligible cost, what the priorities are for funding this year, and how you can best position your library for success in this grant program. It is a state grant program, which means nothing is easy. So at MidHudson, we've tried to boil it down to make it as simple as possible for you. So what you'll see here today are the very basics, along with links that will help you get to more information that will help you prepare yourself for a successful grant application year. So we want to start by saying thank you to everyone who helped to advocate for additional aid this year. We saw a 35% increase to the state aid program for public library construction. That's the first increase in a decade. So thank you to everyone who spoke up and called their legislators, came with us to Albany, and made the case for more money for public library construction funds. This means we're up to a $19 million program. This program is not technically funded through the budget. It's authorized for bonding through the Dormitory Authority of New York State, which means they bond for that money to pay the grants that are awarded through the state. So it does result in some longer periods of time to get our grants through the New York State system, because it means a second set of eyes have to review the grants. Not only does MidHudson review the grants, but the Division of Library Development reviews your grants, as does the Dormitory Authority lawyers. So it is a long process. So I'm going to lay that timeline out for you here this morning. So these funds are authorized through the state budget. They're then overseen and administered by the New York State Division of Library Development, which many of you are familiar with. Sometimes we call them DLD. And I bet I slip a few times today and actually use that acronym. So I just want to make sure you knew what I was talking about. The Division of Library Development. They then task the 23 public library systems, of which MidHudson is one, to actually carry out the grant program. So we're the ones prepping you guys on the grant eligibility and the process, and helping you with technical assistance for your applications and making sure your applications meet their specifications. They get hundreds of applications they have to go through. So we're like the first line of defense to help make sure everything's in order, to send that up to the state to make it very easy to give you the money that you deserve. So that $19 million, unfortunately, not all of it comes to MidHudson, or we'd be a very happy system. They divvy that up amongst the 23 public library systems. Our projections are that we will receive in our region around $700,000 this year. We haven't received the final funding tables from the state. I just did a quick and dirty calculation of what 35% more than we got last year would look like. There are some other formulas behind that, though, so that might not be the exact figure. So of that money, let's point out that this is a matching grant program, which means it's not a straight cash grant to your library. You have to prove that you can match the grant award that MidHudson recommends for you. And we're going to talk a bit more about that, because it's not perhaps as straightforward as you might think. So hold on for that one. We'll talk about matching money a bit more as we get through the presentation. But I do want to point out there is one threshold to keep in mind. There is a minimum grant award amount of $2,500. Which, given that this is a 50% matching program, would mean the total cost of your project at a minimum has to add up to $5,000. So if you had a fairly simple renovation project that was going to come in around $3,500, that would not be eligible for the grant, because half of $3,500 does not hit the $2,500 threshold. So that's our first kind of, is your project eligible or not? Yes or no, is whether or not your project actually fits that minimum grant award threshold of a $5,000 project. So when we take a look at what period of time this grant program covers, what we see here is that technically it's a 3-year grant program, and this is where it starts to get confusing, thank you New York State, because technically this grant program starts on July 1st of this year. However, your applications are not due probably until August, and you're not going to see any money until the summer of 2017. So technically you have 2 years to complete the grant once you receive funding, actual check from the state for your project. You'll have about 2 years until June of 2019 to complete the work that you've applied for through the grant process. Other things to keep in mind, things that you're applying for this summer, They're only for expenditures you've made after July 1st, which is the beginning of the grant period. So if you spent money before July 1st this year, but after January 1st, it could be an eligible cost you could include into your total project cost, but it would not be an expense that you would get grant money for. It would be part of how you calculate the matching funds. So you might say, we're applying for this renovation project, and the total project cost is $5,000. We've spent $1,000 so far in May, and we're going to finish the rest of the project this fall. You could count that $1,000 you spent in May as proof of matching money. So those are other things to keep in mind. If it's a project you've already completed, you may not apply for that for retroactive reimbursement. It has to be a live project, preferably one that has not started yet. But if it has started, if some small element of it has started, only expenditures after January 1st and before June 30th could serve as matching funds. And keep in mind, nothing that you spent prior to January 1 of this year could be included in your project costs, either for the total project cost or as proof of matching money. Now that's a situation that I know you might have just kind of gone cross-eyed during as we were talking about it. So again, if that's something that you feel your project is complicated enough, these dates actually really will be a factor in what you apply for. That's something we can talk about offline to straighten out your thinking about this one. So I just want to really stress this is a competitive grant program. On average, Mid-Hudson member libraries request 2 to 3 times more funds than we have to give out. Obviously, that's going to be a little better with the 35% increase in funds. But for this time around, I still feel it's going to be a competitive grant program, which means that you're going to have to stand out. You're going to have to make sure your project not only has the costs that are eligible under the commissioner's regulations, which we're going to review, but also that you hit the Mid-Hudson priorities for funding. We have to make some tough decisions given that we don't have enough money to fund everything. So you want to make sure your project fits the Mid-Hudson Library System Board's priorities as well as possible to position yourself for the maximum amount of money through this grant award. So we're going to talk about how you do that as we move through today. So I wanted to point out that URL that I sent to you yesterday and again this morning. Much of the information we're going to talk about today is accessible through our website at midhudson.org/NYS Construction Grant. You'll see throughout the presentation, I'll mark where you can go for more information. It all starts at this site. So feel free to pull that up while we're in the webinar and note to yourself that you can get to things that will make your life easier on that webpage. So let's jump right into what's eligible through the grant, because that's usually what people are most interested in. The eligible costs are actually defined in commissioner's regulations, the commissioner being the education commissioner. They write regulations to oversee the money that comes to libraries and systems and also to kind of explain how they expect things to be carried out. So if you're super interested and want to do some really deep digging, you can actually read Commissioner's Regulations 90.12. But I've summarized it here for you to make your life hopefully a bit easier. So you'll see here eligible costs, some very, I would think, expected things you could apply for. Things related to purchasing land or an existing structure that you're going to convert into a new library. Definitely new construction if you're building a building from scratch. That's very easy to make the case for. Also additions to existing library buildings and also getting ready for construction. So if you're thinking you've got a really big project and you want to see if you could get multiple years worth of grants, you could say in year 1 for this new building project or an addition that you're going to apply for the demolition and site preparation. So knocking down a portion of a building or getting the acreage ready for construction or putting a foundation in, you could consider that as phase 1 of a project perhaps. So the next year you could apply for something else. That's something a little more complicated. And again, we'll talk about that more as we move forward today. Other things that are eligible are related to the renovation and rehabilitation of your existing building. So you can see here very specifically, they're looking for the application of green technologies such as photovoltaics, geothermal, and other alternative energy sources. We're seeing a big push this year for the regulations to be updated to be more explicit about the area of sustainable design. We'll see what happens there. But you'll also see the Mid-Hudson Board is incentivizing sustainable design, and we're going to point that out to you in a bit. Very simple things like replacement of roof, windows, and doors. I would like to point out to you that while those things are eligible, they must be in the context of energy conservation. So it's not enough that it's time to replace your roof. You have to make the case that you're increasing the insulation, or you're increasing the R value of the roof or windows to be eligible and therefore get the grant through MidHudson. You can do reconstruction of existing space. So if you're tearing down walls to expand an area for increased use in the public's ability to use your space, that would be something. But reconstruction must involve construction. So if it might be tearing something down, it might be building new walls, but you couldn't just say it was for we're going to paint this room. You couldn't just paint a room and apply for a construction grant for that, or paint the whole interior of the library. Painting and new carpeting have to be tied to actual construction work as well. So tearing down or putting in a new ceiling or building a new wall, plus painting the interior of the library. So the painting and carpeting actually falls under the routine maintenance category, which is not eligible. So I'll point that out to you. Accessibility is obviously huge. That's a very easy case to make in your grant, that your building's not fully handicap accessible. And you'll note for the directors on the call who have received the new construction needs memo, the action memo that came out last week, you'll note that we now refer to the ADA checklist to help you assess, is your building fully handicap accessible or not? Because we really want to see a maximum number of libraries have full accessibility to people of all mobility levels. So installation of elevators, again, another accessibility issue. The new electrical, plumbing, lighting, and HVAC, super exciting stuff. Again, should be tied to new construction and energy conservation. New driveways, sidewalks, and parking lot again, falls into the accessibility category. So if that's a category you're thinking of applying in, be sure that you're speaking about how it improves accessibility to your facility. Now, that last one on this slide, I really want to stress, you can apply for new furniture, equipment, and shelving, which is exciting, right? Equipment can involve tech. It could be new computers for the public, or a smart board for a meeting room or something like that. But you can't apply for that stuff on its own. It has to be in the context of a construction project. And for those of you that applied in the past, I just wanted to give you a heads up that the Division of Library Development has changed their thinking on this. This used to be something they would allow you to apply for on its own if you had a recent construction grant to construct or renovate your space. So say the last fiscal year you got a grant to renovate your children's room, and then the next year you wanted to apply for the fixtures, furnishings, and tech. They no longer allow that. You have to apply for both of those things in one grant application. So again, it has to be in the context of new or newly renovated space in that same grant application, just like when we were talking about painting and carpeting. So these are 4 things that are relatively new that have been added to the eligibility list. So if you applied a few years ago, you may think these things aren't eligible, but they are now. They've added in emergency generators, acknowledging that libraries play a very important role in our communities when it comes to ensuring people can get back to normal sooner rather than later during a major power outage or an extended power outage, like we saw with Hurricanes Irene and Superstorm Sandy. Outdoor signage, which I think is fantastic, because if you think about it, that can really increase accessibility to your library when people know you're there and know what you have to offer and would want to come in. So if you want to see a good example of that, you can check out the Marlboro Library in Ulster County. They were our first library to apply for outdoor signage. They have a fantastic electronic signage now that faces on 9W, both directions, north and south. They estimate around, I believe they said around 20,000 people a day see that signage, which really increases their visibility. So that's a pretty good thing to be thinking about if that's something you don't have. The other new things you see here are the supervision and management of the construction, renovation, or rehabilitation. Because we find when projects have a clerk of the works or a experienced contractor who is serving as your owner's representative, meaning your representative at the library, you see costs come down, change orders are reduced, and a more efficient construction schedule can be kept. It can save you a lot of money. So the state's willing to invest in that position for you for your project. They do not allow for architectural fees though. So you can't pay your architect out of this money, but you could do construction management payments out of this. And the other pretty cool thing is if your library is struggling to have the broadband accessibility that your community really needs, you can use this money to leverage bringing fiber right to your building, which if you're paying attention to some of the work our executive director, Tom Sloan, is doing, he's working to get reduced costs from vendors to do just that. So if you're thinking about jumping on that RFP he's talking about currently, this is a way to find some extra money to leverage those new pricing schedules he's coming up with. So another cool thing to keep in mind. So jumping to what's not eligible, we've covered a bunch of this already, but routine maintenance is not eligible. So unless you can make the case that, again, painting, carpeting, brick repointing is related to a bigger construction project or an energy conservation project, you're not going to get funding for that type of thing. Even repaving your parking lot has to be tied to accessibility, not just because it's time to do this. These are things that you know are coming. They are, if you think about the end of the useful life of your building when it comes to your roof or your HVAC equipment, those are things your board should have been planning for long term and saving up money to do. This grant funding is not for those types of things. It's to speak to the priority areas that we've set as a system, which we're going to talk about in a bit. And I've mentioned a couple of them already, accessibility and energy conservation being 2 of the 5. So we talked about before, architectural engineering firm fees not eligible. You can't pay for a fancy building consultant to come in and help you, unfortunately. I think that'd be good if you could. You can't pay for your interest or any of your carrying charges on bonds financing the project. And just an aside here, I know we have a few libraries on the webinar who are funding their projects through a bond, through a referendum that was passed by the public that will be bonded through their school district or their town. One important thing for you to note, if you're applying for this grant, your total project cost for the purposes of the grant must be more than the amount you received through your bond. So if you received a $2 million, say a $5 million bond, your total project cost for the purposes of this grant must show costs above and beyond the amount you're getting through the bond. So that might sound weird that you have to add costs. Most libraries have no problem doing that because they have costs beyond the bond. But the grant needs you to prove you have costs that are not covered by the bond, and only those costs are the ones eligible for this grant program. So you can see here also mortgage payments you cannot pay for through the program, no books or library materials, and no landscaping unto itself. So if you were just doing a beautification project, a standalone project for landscaping would not be eligible. If there happen to be landscaping elements in a project related to, say, renovating the front walk of your library and redoing your parking lot, those may be eligible. We just have to take a look at the scope of what percentage perhaps of your costs are related to landscaping versus the work to be done to actually increase accessibility to your library. So when we talked before about there's 2 levels here. There's what's eligible under the commissioner's regulations, and then there's the Mid-Hudson Library System's board's funding priorities. Because we have to rank and recommend awards to our member libraries, and we have more requests than we can handle in terms of the amount of money we have to give out, we have to have a way to prioritize things. So the library board, the system board, has come up with 2 major ways to do that. So your top level, you're making sure what you want to apply for is actually eligible under the commissioner's regulations. And then the second thing you're taking a look at is what you want to apply for. Is that part of a board approved long range plan or a prioritized facility plan or master facility plan, which means your board has considered the facility in totality and has identified priorities to address based on what's most important to the community. So it's not a project that just popped into your head yesterday or while we're talking here today. It's something that's your board has on the horizon, has been thinking about for a while, has been pooling the resources to get to, understands that if we address this first, it will facilitate a priority or something else in our long-range plan. So anytime well, first of all, you're going to have to file this plan with us through that memo we mentioned earlier that went out to directors last week. That memo was due May 20th, so if you'll notice, I was kind and I gave you enough time to perhaps at your May board meeting come up with that plan and get it board approved so you can submit it to us. But again, this is not something something that you just popped into your head and want to try. It needs to be in the context of what will have the most impact for your community. That's what our board is super interested in hearing about. And when you come to the technical assistance workshop in June, we talk very carefully and help you step by step make your case for this funding. So your impact statement is as strong as it can be, because that's really where the board wants to invest its money, where the biggest impact will be had for a community in our system. So I mentioned here there's a sample facility plan outline. If you don't have one right now, don't freak out. It doesn't have to be crazy complicated. What we really just want to see is that you've assessed your building as a whole, and then have said, you might have just kind of like always felt like, yeah, we're accessible to everyone. But then when you actually walked around the building, you realized, oh, you know what? No one can actually get into the local history room. That's not okay. And all of a sudden that gets put on the list when that hadn't been thought of prior. So the facility plan outline I'm going to show you here is related to two things, both capturing some of the information you need to do the preventative maintenance that extends the life of your building. So you'll see that age of major systems opportunity there to make sure you are capturing the age of the roof or the HVAC system. You know what schedule it gets maintained on, when it may need to be replaced. So I don't want you to be like the library that called me 3 years ago in January during a really rough winter and was super upset because their boiler had blown and they desperately needed money, emergency money, to pay for this. And I was like, wow, this must be a relatively new boiler that you don't have any money saved up for it. And they're like, no, it's original to the building. And so I pointed out that their building had been built in the 1800s and that possibly they could have predicted that that boiler was going to, have the end of useful life sometime in this decade at least. So we want to see libraries that are planning ahead, that are saving for those expected capital expenditures and investing the grant funds to then elevate those projects to a higher level of energy conservation. Other things you'll see here are capturing things you need to do related to the outdoor. The outdoors related to accessibility or lighting, perhaps. Your full accessibility assessment. Have you gone through the checklist provided in the action memo to ensure your building is as closely aligned with the Americans with Disability Act as possible? Our libraries are supposed to be all about accessing information. And if people can't access your building today, that means they're not accessing all the information, given the level of programming that most libraries are doing today. So making sure you've got all your code compliance issues taken care of. If you've done an energy consumption assessment through NYSERDA, capturing those recommendations and prioritizing them. If you're going to do renovation or one of those energy efficiency projects, or have come to the realization that you need to expand, all of this should be captured in one place so the board can carefully consider what things need to be addressed first. And to make sure you don't do something silly like invest in a new roof and then 5 years from now tear down the whole building and build a new one. So we want to see libraries that have put forethought into the projects they're applying for through this grant program. Vivian has shared a question here in the chat box that I'm going to go ahead and answer now. The question is, does the building have to be owned by the library? The answer is not necessarily. It's easier if you own it, free and clear, and you can do what you need to do with it. However, if you don't own it, to be eligible, you need to prove you have a minimum of a 10-year lease agreement with the owner. So for example, last night I was at the Clinton Library, and their building is actually owned by the town of Clinton, and they have a lease agreement. They pay something like, I believe it's less than $100 a year to lease that space, but it's a 50-year lease, so they would be eligible. However, the LaGrange Library has a lease with an owner that's under 10 years, so they would not be eligible because the state wants to see that the money invested would be in a usable space for over 10 years. So we have the MidHudson Library Board's priority of making sure you've got a board-approved facility plan and you've prioritized that and you're applying for one of your prioritized items. And then they want to see that your project provides for at least one of the following. It doesn't have to hit all 5, but the more you hit, the higher your project will be ranked. So think of these as points, basically, that your project earns when the board reviews and ranks your application. So the full explanation of all of these is on that website that I pointed out to you, but I will give you a brief explanation here right now of what each of these means. An increase in services is pretty specifically, they're looking to see that you've increased the usable public space, or you've increased staff efficiencies through rearranging perhaps like the circulation or checkout desk area and the backroom activities to increase staff efficiency in serving the public. But mostly what we're seeing are projects that increase usable space, either taking formerly unused space and converting it to programming space or expanded collection areas, or expanding the building or building a brand new building. What we're looking for here are things that fall into the categories of new buildings, additions, renovations to those existing areas for new users. So if you can also make the case that what you're doing will appeal to a new segment of your community, that's a very strong case that you can make. So increase in services is probably the one that people would think of most, where you're increasing the usable space available to the public. An increase in access, the system board has fine-tuned the language related to this one. So it's not just about access for people with disabilities. While that's their first priority, they want to see that you're complying with the Americans with Disability Act, they're also interested in access from the standpoint of increased access through improved broadband, or optimization of a space that would bring in a new or underserved population. For example, a library that never had a teen space before has now been able to carve out a room or an area of their library and renovated it as such that it would be attractive and bring in a whole new demographic to the library who hadn't come in before. So they define access broadly. So consider that as you're writing your grant and see perhaps it's not just your increase in services point you could get, but if worded properly, you might be able to get that increase in access point as well. So the third one you see here is energy conservation. And we want to speak a bit about this one because it's not just something that your vendor told you would be more would be conserving more energy. What we want to see are projects that are doing energy conservation work, quote unquote, in the context of a professional's recommendation or with a historic preservation element. So what we're looking for at the very least is that you've had an energy audit done by the state's Energy Research and Development Authority, which is called NYSERDA, for those of you who aren't familiar. And on the Mid-Hudson page that you see linked down there at the bottom, you'll find a link to where you can have one of those done if you haven't done it before. You'll see that they're free for the most part, unless you're a much larger library. And if that's your case, give me a call and we'll figure something out. But what we want to see is recommendations made by a third party, someone who doesn't have a vested financial interest in making your library more energy efficient. We also want to point out that Mid-Hudson now has what we call the Useful Life Energy Conservation Standards. So what we're looking for, libraries that are applying for energy conservation projects, if you're replacing the roof or windows and new doors or insulation, we want to see that the products that you're picking are Energy Star products. So this document, which you can download on the webpage, again, that we had pointed out, it lays out for you the expectations we have of what standards of energy efficiency you're going to be reaching through the installation of new windows or a new roof with insulation, whatever that might look like. So it's not just, of course, anything new would be better. We actually want to be sure we're testing that against a standard. So we've chosen the nationally known Energy Star standard for that, and you can learn more about that through that document that we've pointed out there, the Mid-Hudson Useful Life Energy Conservation Standards. Now we have two new points you can earn this year. Because of past experiences we've had with libraries that have applied, we've created two new points a library could potentially get when we're ranking their applications. One is if your project is related to disaster recovery. And we do have some language that defines what makes for a disaster, because what one library thinks is a disaster might not be what another library thinks is a disaster. So our board has been clear that you have to demonstrate a substantial loss of access to library services because of a low probability, high consequence event. So our most famous example of this is the Phoenicia Library that suffered a fire that gutted their building. That's a pretty substantial loss of access. They had to go to a temporary location, which they absolutely made the best of and probably did a kick-ass job in the situation they were given, but that was a substantial loss. It was a low probability, high consequence event. It was unlikely a building would catch on fire and completely gut it, and it had a very high consequence for that community. So that would definitely qualify for this disaster recovery. If your library is located in a national or a state declared emergency area, that would also lend itself to describing your project as coming under this new point. But either way, you still have to describe these three things. The length of forewarning, meaning it wasn't that you had a flooding in the basement in your children's room is in the basement and the whole room is flooded, and it was flooded because you had an aging HVAC system that wasn't maintained properly. That was something you could have seen coming. But if it was because there was, the 100-year flood came and your building was in that floodplain's path, that definitely would be something that would be a high consequence and a lower probability because it happens only once every couple hundred years. So you want to talk about the magnitude of impact. Was it the room was closed for a day, or the room was closed for 8 months while you had to do a renovation? That would also lend itself to being more what the board is considering for this point. And obviously see the duration of that impact. So if it only impacted in the magnitude section a closet versus the children's room, did it last a day versus months or a year? These are the types of things that make your case that you would get this disaster recovery point. The fifth brand new point that can be earned starting this year, and we don't expect many to have it this year, but we're hoping to incentivize this for the future. We're looking for more libraries to start their projects with an eye towards sustainable design using recognized standard certification systems. So not just saying, oh yeah, we built green because we slapped solar panels on the roof. We want to see libraries that are holistically considering how to make their buildings not only as energy efficient as possible, but are building the healthiest possible buildings for the occupants, meaning your library workers and patrons, as well as for the people that live in the areas where products for your building are produced. And the first three that you see there, the first one being the most popular internationally, is the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design certification system. That's a program that takes a look and makes you walk through when you're picking the site for a library, or the products that you'll use and how far away did they come from. Are you actually making your building as energy efficient as possible? Is the air quality as good as possible? So it's helping you think through making good choices for every aspect of your construction project. There's LEED certification for brand new buildings and for existing buildings. So don't think that if you're not building a brand new building, that might not be an option for you. There's two other certifications that are less popular, but equally good in terms of thinking about your building holistically, which are Green Globes, which is the second program after LEED that the federal government uses to build their buildings. And interesting to note, all buildings built by the federal government must meet either LEED or Green Globe standards. So it's not like MidHudson is making this stuff up. This is an accepted practice at the federal level and is also becoming so at the state level. And so we're hoping to see this become something new for libraries in the state, and MidHudson's going to try to trailblaze here. So again, you're not required to do this, but you certainly would benefit from it if you did, not only because it's the right thing to do for the people that you serve and the people who work in your buildings, but because you could also be getting an extra point and therefore a bit of extra money through the grant program if you are following one of these certification programs. The two on the bottom, Energy Star and Passive House, are related specifically to energy efficiency. So they don't take that whole look at the building. But we believe that even creating a standard way to think about energy efficiency in your project is better than nothing. So if your library wants to take a look at the certification process for either of those as well, that could be very beneficial, again, to your operating costs for decades to come, as well as to get you a little more money from the grant program. We're actually really pleased to say that for Passive House, we actually have the first library in the country that will be certified Passive House, which is the Phoenicia Library. For questions that are coming up in chat, we're going to revisit those during the question and answer period. So those are the 5 points that you would earn during the ranking process through the Mid-Hudson Library System Board's recommendation procedures, right? You've got the increase in services, increase in access, energy conservation, disaster recovery, leadership and sustainable design. And they want to see that you hit at least one of those. And if you can hit more, you'll be ranked higher. So just for the third time, I'm going to say this, you got to be strategic. You have to cross-reference our priorities here in Mid-Hudson with what is eligible. So if you want to be obstinate and say, well, it says it's eligible in the commissioner's regulations, that doesn't mean that the Mid-Hudson board has to fund it unless you've made the case related to their funding priorities. So again, we have to have a way to prioritize these, and that's the way the board has voted to do so this year. So let's talk a bit about matching funds. We mentioned before this is a matching fund program, and you'll see that for a long time, and is still the case, that it's technically a 50% match. So of the total project approved costs, meaning your total project might cost $5,000 or $10,000, let's say, and so we could fund you up to $5,000 of that. That would be a 50% match. What it means by approved costs is that your $10,000 project, your total project costs might include some ineligible costs, meaning you might say our total project cost is $10,000, but $2,000 of that was to pay the architect, which is not eligible. So your total approved costs are actually $8,000, of which we could give you a $4,000 grant to match that grant. If you meet what's called the economically disadvantaged community definition, which we're going to go over in a second, MidHudson can actually fund up to 75% of your project. That means you're hitting a threshold related to poverty or student lunch enrollment that would say your community is economically disadvantaged, and therefore your library would be eligible for a higher match award amount. So you've got the specifics of this. This is also on the website, so you'll have that to refer back to. You have to hit number 1, 2, or 3. And number 3 is a combination of 1 and 2 with lower thresholds. So you can see poverty, which is more than 15% on its own, hits you for that higher match amount. Or if you've got 40% or more of the kids eligible for school lunch, that standalone is enough to trigger that higher match amount. If you've got lower numbers in your community, if you combine two things you see there in number 3, 10% or more of the population under poverty and 30% or more using the school lunch program, those two combined would also trigger that higher match award amount. So just coming back here to the matching funds, I want to be very clear that because we have so many libraries applying for these funds, it's rare that we're actually able to give a library a full 50% match or that full 75% match if you happen to be eligible for that, which means your library is going to have to prove that whatever grant award amount the board settles on for your library, that you can match that amount. Even if we came in at 10% of what you asked for, you have to have the other 90% to pay the difference in order to receive the grant. So when you're starting the grant application process, it's advisable that you actually have the cash in hand for your whole project when you're applying to make the case that regardless of the amount you receive, you'll be able to complete the project. We know that many association libraries are not in that situation. They don't have all of the cash in hand at the time of application. And those are libraries that I'm very happy to work with to try to figure out solutions as you move forward. We usually find ways to make things work, but it is much harder for those association libraries that are grinding through a capital campaign. So if that's the situation you're in, as I said, I'm happy to work with you and find solutions if we can, but I do want to be clear that your grant award is highly likely not to be 50% of what you're asking for. And therefore, there may be a gap in terms of how you pay for that difference if you're not thinking about that today. So think about that now. You are going to have to prove your match amount. At the time of application, they only ask you to prove up to 50%. But as I said before, if you can prove more, you're going to be more assured of receiving your grant funds at the end of this process. So we talked about the economically disadvantaged community definition. Reminder, we've done that. That definition is on the website for you. We've done the matching funds reality check that regardless of the recommended award amount, you will still need to match the remainder of the project. And so how we handle that is once the board makes their decision about how much to recommend for an award for your grant, I come back to you with a memo stating this is the award amount we're able to offer you this year. Do you want to proceed with that amount? Which means that you have to prove you have the rest of the money to complete that project. So at that time, which would be this fall, you do have the chance to say, you know what, our funding just isn't there. We're not going to be able to accept a grant that's lower than we expected. Or you might be able to say, you know what, we're fine. We can completely match that. We're happy to take whatever the grant program can give us. So you do have the opportunity at that point to either accept to move forward with that understood grant amount, or to say, nope, we're out. We can't make that happen. So it's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't be considered for a grant in the coming year if your financial situation changes, but you do have to be very honest because you cannot turn this money back once you accept it. And I cannot be more serious about that. you will not jeopardize this entire state program by turning back construction money after the fact. So your project better be in a good place when you're applying. You better have your finances in order when you're applying, and you better be good to go when that money comes through next summer to complete your project. For libraries that have failed to do this in the past, your life gets very uncomfortable with calls from the state, and it's not a position you want to be in. So I appreciate that you're here today listening to the parameters of this grant, and you're thinking early about what's feasible for your project and for your library to get done within this grant period, because it's no joke when you get to the state level. If you have to tell the dormitory authority, or the state library has to tell the dormitory authority, oh no, we actually can't use all of the money that was appropriated to us, you jeopardize the entire $19 million program. And I certainly don't want any of our Mid-Hudson people playing that role at the state level. Was that serious enough for you guys? All right, good. So moving on. This is the timeline, which are some dates we don't quite know yet because the state hasn't announced them. But your memo, which is the first step to applying, and that's been sent to all directors via the Mid-Hudson alerts list last week, I believe. That's now live and available to fill out, and that's both for libraries that are going to apply this year and are not going to apply this year. Those that are going to apply have a second part to the memo that they fill out that declares their intent and demonstrates they're in a good position to apply this year. So you've got over a month to do that memo, so that's not due till May 20th. The online application usually is open in June. I'm sorry I can't predict when in June. DLD often tells us June 1st, and then we don't see it until the end of June. But as soon as we know, we'll let you know, so you know when to expect that. But I went ahead and scheduled what I call the Technical Assistance Workshop for June 7th, which will be held here at Mid-Hudson. That's an in-person event where we just walk through the application step by step, so you know exactly how to answer all the questions and exactly how to fill out all the paperwork. There's a unfortunate number of attachments to the grant application, many of which look intimidating. And over the course of years, I've administered this project for over a decade. I think I can lessen your fears or freaking outness about those forms. They are not as bad as they look, honestly. So coming to that technical assistance workshop can save you a lot of time. And I'm not pointing any fingers here, but I do know that many people procrastinate when it comes to grant writing. And if you take the time to come to that technical assistance workshop, should you procrastinate to the week before the grant is due, you'll have a much better chance at actually getting it done on time. When you ask the question, when is the grant actually due, it will be a date that's set in August based on when the online application becomes available. That grant application deadline is the deadline for you to submit your applications through the online portal, which is provided by the state. At that time, the applications come here to Mid-Hudson and we review them for completeness, and we summarize them for the Mid-Hudson Board's committee, which is called the Incentives Committee, which will review your application and rank them against the priorities we've discussed here today. At that time, they come up with a list of who they recommend for funding and who they do not recommend for funding, and at what dollar amounts they recommend those projects for funding. That gets forwarded to our full board for their consideration at their September 14th meeting. If that goes well and they say yes to the recommendation, I then contact your library and let you know the amount the board is going to recommend to the state for you. And I ask you that critical question of whether or not you feel you can move forward, given your financial situation, with that amount of money or not. So you'll have maybe a week or two to say, yep, we're moving forward. And then I work with you to fine tune your grant. Sometimes there's little fixes we have to make it perfect for the state, because we don't want them getting kicked back from the state and holding the whole state up. So there's still a little bit of cleanup work likely to be done. You'll get a little hit list from me of things that need to be fixed. And then usually the state sets a deadline for us here at the system to get those final perfect grant applications up to them in October. And that's a date they'll be setting, I would imagine, quite soon. So we'll get those dates firmed up, I'd imagine, in the next month, I would hope. We have a call with the Division of Library Development this afternoon, and my fingers are crossed that we'll get some better information from them today, if not our call with them in May. So that's the application process in terms of your hands-on working with the application. But then comes this quite prolonged review period where we then have sent these applications to the state. They then have to review every application from every library throughout the state, and they try to do do that before Thanksgiving. I can say they have not hit that deadline in the past 2 years. It usually takes them closer to the end of the year to review those. And at that time, they might come back and have some questions. They mediate those questions through me. So a lot of times I can make a fix on your behalf. If I can't, I'll give you a call and say, hey, we've got to fix this, and we get it done. Those then are pushed on to the lawyers of the dormitory authority, which take a very critical eye to our applications, in particular, any application that's coming from a library who has a project that is bonded for. So if you're one of those libraries, that's the critical time to be worried because if they come back and aren't happy with what your finances look like or the paperwork related to your bond, that can cause some angst and agita. So usually they finish up the review of all of the applications, and they don't do them system by system. They do all of the statewide applications before they move to the next phase of anything, which really does obviously slow down the process. So what we've seen in the past 3 years is that libraries are notified in either June or July that their grant has been successful, and whether or not the amount that MidHudson has recommended for your library is in fact your grant award. So you can't announce any grant from this program until that time. So we're talking about next summer. So if I tell you an amount in October, that's not an amount you make public because we don't know if that's going to be the end number at the end of the day. So it's not until this next summer you get that official notification from the state librarian, Bernie Margolis, that says, congratulations, you've been awarded a grant. And then shortly thereafter, you get a check for 90% of the award amount. It's actually called a 40, 50, 10 payout, but because it takes them so long, they combine the 40 and 50% and just give you a 90% payout right after the notification. The remaining 10% of the grant is held by the state until you complete your project. And a reminder, that needs to be completed by June of 2019. You can certainly complete it early. You might already be done by next summer at the rate of some of the projects that we deal with through this grant project, at which time you could immediately apply for the release of that final 10%. You're filing that final report through the same portal, the online portal that you filed the application for. That's obviously stuff you're not thinking too much about here today as you think about how to apply. But that's just a little heads up for you that everything is supposed to happen within that portal. I will point out that once I send those applications in October to the state, there's not a lot I can do to help you. So if you get the grant next summer and there's any problems, I am very unlikely to be able to fix things for you, which is why it's good to have everything in order and to be very confident you can finish the project as described at the time of application. If you've got things that are in flux or you're not quite sure if you're going to be able to get this money or the purchase might not go through, those are not the kind of situations you want to find yourself in. You want to have a guaranteed project that you can complete. Otherwise your life gets, as I said, very uncomfortable with the state scrutiny on a situation like that. So just a reminder, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but don't procrastinate. There's a number of things that are out of your control in this process. When you are getting quotes for a project, any of you that have gone through this before, contractors don't necessarily get back to you on your schedule. So waiting until the last week to try to get your bids from your contractors is going to likely cause you some problems and possibly mean you don't meet the deadline. And I will be clear, just as last year, there will be no extensions to the system deadline for your application. For those of you that applied maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was kind of mushy about that and I'd give you an extension. Okay, you can have another week. I can't do that anymore. The timeline is tight enough and our review period is involved enough that I have to stick to the deadline. There are no exceptions to that. So if your complete application is not done by that date, you're not going to have an application that's considered. And that date we're talking about is the one in August. So if I'm not mistaken, we're in April now. So you have plenty of time to be doing things like you see on this slide, getting your project bid and quote figures. If your building is more than 50-year-old, you may need to get approval from the State Historic Preservation Office, which is often referred to as SHPO. You see that acronym there, SHPO, SHPO approval. They have 30 days to respond to you. So there's paperwork I encourage you to read on the MidHudson site, that website that I pointed out to you earlier, related to this particular item. If your building is more than 50 years old, make a note to yourself right now to go and read the agreement that SHPO has with the Division of Library Development for what types of projects require their approval and which ones do not. Because again, if your project requires that approval, they do have 30 days to respond to you. And if you procrastinate and don't remember this until a week before the application deadline, they very likely could put the kibosh on your application, which is not where you want to find yourself. Other things that can take some time, that NYSERDA energy assessment, if you're going for a project that falls under the energy conservation category. Again, get that process started sooner rather than later. You're going to want to register for what's called the New York State Directory Service account. You can find the information and link for how to do that through that page on the MidHudson website that we've pointed out to you. This is the login information for the online application. And it's not an instantaneous assignment of your login and password. They actually have there's a lag between when you apply for it and when you receive it. Another thing you don't want to be worried about, like the night before your application is due. If you don't have a New York State vendor ID, you're going to have to get one. That also might take you longer than you would think or hope. The information for how to do that is also on the page on the MidHudson website. And it sounds silly to remind you, but I will, to take before photos. They require before and after photos. And I've certainly had more than one library who forgot to do that and had a problem, believe it or not. So this is the website again, midhudson.org/NYS construction grant. These are all the things that you can do and see there, the full information about the MidHudson funding priorities, that definition for the economically disadvantaged community is there, as well as where you go to get the vendor number and the directory service account so you can log into the grant once it's released. So I think everything you would need to be getting yourself ready for the grant period is available there. Certainly if I've forgotten something, I'd appreciate if you'd let me know. That'd be great, so we can make that better for everybody. So just a reminder, if you decide to move forward and apply for the grant and you haven't applied before, even if you have applied before, you might want to come to the Technical Assistance Workshop. That'll be on Tuesday, June 7th from 10 to 12 here in Poughkeepsie at the MidHudson Library System Auditorium. As in years past, I will also offer what we call office hours, so you can book time with me to go through your questions. So I would say, I would encourage you to actually go through your application and fill out as much as you can and then come up with your questions before shooting me emails and calling. It's better to bundle those things, schedule time with me, and then we go over what your issues are all at one time. It'll make you feel less crazy and also make me feel less crazy, because there's not just you applying, there's usually about 20 libraries applying. So I'll announce those office hours to those people that indicate through the action memo that they're going to move forward with an application. Again, I would encourage you, do not procrastinate. And I know it's funny, I've said this word like 3 times during this presentation, but as I said, I've done this program for about 10 years, and I always feel so bad for the libraries that have waited way too long to come up with their idea or get their quotes or realize they need the SHPO approval. You get really stressed out when you find yourself in that situation. So please do yourself a favor, look at that checklist I provided you with about those things not to procrastinate about, and just go ahead and put them on your to-do list today. Your future self will thank you. So this is my contact information if you need to get in touch with me to figure out if your project is eligible or not, or how to answer the construction needs memo and the intent to apply memo if you're confused about that. I'm happy to help you get in position and make sure you're in a good place to apply as you move forward with this process. So before we end the recording, I just want to say again, thank you for taking the time to learn more about this grant program. We're going to stop the recording now, and then we'll open up the Q&A session. So just give me a sec.